and that at a time of moral crisis. And if you're religious, God knows there is a moral crisis. He did something. I've known him for 40 years. He's always done something. And he's never been concerned about the consequences for himself. And perhaps the real test is whether we survive as a species. Whether enough of us will, the moment of moral crisis, which is nearly overwhelming us now, stand up and do something. And you don't see a lot of movements. The Attica Prison Rebellion was questionably, but generally described in the 70s as the bloodiest day on American soil since the Civil War. And speaking of the last day. And it tells a lot about our country. There's not much difference between our countries, to your disadvantage. In New York State in 1971, at the time of the prison rebellion, there were 12,000 prisoners. We reached 75,000 a few years ago. And then when the economic crisis set in, we started slowing down. So it shows we didn't really care that much. As long as we had plenty of money, we'd just stick people in and brutalize them, destroy lives and family lives, friends' lives. In 1971, there were fewer than 20,000 federal prisoners, or 180,000 now. The prison population in the United States is beyond imagination. More than 3 million people are in custody today, in jails, prisons, federal and state and local, throughout the United States. What an indictment. And a lot of it is being privatized, profit on prisons. I mean, we're out of our minds. Don't we see the moral crisis there? Don't we know what we're doing to our children, to ourselves? Dr. Joya has two things about, in his genes, you might say, if you want to put it that way, not the ones he's wearing, G-E-N-E-S, that cause him to do what he does. He has native blood. And if there's anybody around here in our parts, including Texas, where I come from, you never ask him, mind if he's from Texas, because if he is, he'll tell you, and if he's not, you'll embarrass him. But there's not anyone who understands in their genes, that is in their very being, without even thinking about it, what it means to have strange people come on your land with weapons that are more powerful than you can possibly resist, and just start killing you and running you off. They know. They experienced it from one coast to the other. And then the second of the two great crimes against humanity that the governments employ, violence and segregation. They put them in reservations or a form of prison, deprive them of means to be involved in everything that's going on around them. To be somebody. To be even able to rise in a moral crisis and do something, because you're not part of the place, But then there's Attica. I was a lawyer, I had to know all the details. And, Charlie Joe and John, as we called him then, were what was called the transfer company. They were juveniles. They weren't supposed to be there. They were being held temporarily until they could be relocated to a juvenile facility. But they were put in the yard with the adult inmates. And this is a maximum security adult offender, overwhelmingly violent offender prison. And here are these two kids in there. And the scene where it happened was a place called Times Square. Franklin Roosevelt, as governor, dedicated this prison. It was called a model prison. They're always models, you know. It was like, it's so painful to think of Quakers designing prisons where everybody had a separate room so they could contemplate, you know, which is the ultimate segregation. But anyway, there were 4 big prison blocks. And there were 2 walkways that joined them that were covered and very secure. And there were yards, 4 yards. And there's a place called Times Square in the middle, which had gates you could open, you could completely close them, and get the prisoners going to the cafeteria, get them going to another cell block, but you all have to come through Times Square, which is a control center and a very secure place. The prisoners came charging in, as many as could get in D time. And they came to D gate at Times Square with these steel bars, and they got 2 or 3 on top of each other, and they were shaking on the bars. And economic corruption, literally, caused the bars to give way. So I mean, it's kind of like a BP, perhaps, who knows why in the world that thing didn't go right. But what had happened is, iron bars are pretty darn expensive. These are heavy iron bars. They were sophisticated things because they had to go up and down, you know. And they ordered them and they were too short. So rather than just ordering new ones that were long enough, they welded pieces on the bottom of the bar. And the guys started shaking the thing, and the welds broke, and the bars broke. There were more people in there than sardines in a can. And they were wailing and whamming away at everybody. The 2 they chose, one guard was severely injured, and 48 hours later he died. The prisoners themselves, and it was Muslim prisoners, it was Muslim prisoners who were a remarkable group of men. And anytime you want to think about Islam, you have to wonder why it has such enormous power in prisons. And why it reaches people who've never had any discipline or organization in their lives, and suddenly they're getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and washing and praying. And they carried Quinn out. And there were negotiations that were hopeful until Quinn died. And when Quinn died, everybody knew it was over. Now, how did they choose in this great melee when you could never see? Quinn got, all of them, everybody got hurt. The inmates got hurt in there. Not nearly as bad as they got hurt out in the yard later, because they were brutally beaten for days. I mean, brutally beaten, they don't take it, man. The reason that these 2 kids were picked was that the other inmates didn't really know them that well. They couldn't identify them as well. There'd be no witnesses. John had a couple of guys that testified for him. But if it had been one of the senior inmates, they wouldn't have any witnesses against them. So they had to pick these 2 kids. They had to have somebody to pin the death of Quinn on. And they picked these 2 kids. It was quite an astounding thing. There was no evidence, and there's no evidence they did anything that anybody else didn't do. It was a joke. Charlie's conviction was for attempted assault in the 2nd degree, which means he attempted but didn't, and in the 2nd degree, which means he served more time already than the maximum sentence for that offense could have caused. But when you look at the 43 people that were killed, this tells you at a different level more about our moral crisis of character.